Life, as I have come to learn through the slow, agonizing passage of decades, is a fragile construction. We build our existence on the comforting illusion of safety, a thin veneer of normalcy that we wrap around ourselves like a tattered blanket. We go about our mundane routines, convinced that the world operates on logic, on predictable patterns, and on the simple laws of cause and effect. We believe that if we follow the rules, if we walk the paved paths and stay under the glow of the streetlights, nothing can reach out from the dark to touch us. But that is a lie, a necessary, desperate lie we tell ourselves to keep the primal terror of the unknown at bay. The truth is far more jagged. The truth is that life is strange, volatile, and profoundly indifferent to our sense of order. Unusual situations occur so suddenly, so violently out of nowhere, that they leave you with nothing but a hollow chest, a heart that hammers like a trapped bird, and a lifetime of unanswerable questions. Some people experience these ruptures and find a way to mend the fabric of their lives. I was not one of those people. Something happened to me years ago, a fracture in reality that never quite fused back together. I wish I could say I've moved on, that the passage of 25 years has acted as a balm to the psychic wounds inflicted during that singular, frozen winter. I wish I could tell you that I am a woman who lives in the present, unburdened by the ghosts of her youth, but I haven't moved on. Those memories didn't fade with time, they didn't soften into the hazy, nostalgic glow that usually colors childhood recollections, blurring the edges of fear until it looks like a story told by someone else. Instead, they've stayed. They've sharpened, like a blade kept in a drawer, waiting for a hand to find it. They haunt the periphery of my vision, lurking in the corner of every room I enter, waiting for the lights to dim or for a cold draft to catch me unawares. It was during the deep, bone-chilling height of winter in my 12th year. In that part of the world, during that time of year, the sky was not a canvas, it was a thief. It stole Thea's sun early, turning from a pale, sickly yellow to a bruised, pitch-black indigo as early as 4:30 p.m. There was no transition, no golden hour where the world felt soft and inviting. One moment you were in the harsh light of day, and the next, you were submerged in a heavy, ink-like darkness that seemed to swallow sound and warmth alike. By the time the final school bell rang for those of us unlucky enough to be taking extra classes, the world was already dead. I was in grade 6 back then, 11 years old, an age where you are caught in that precarious middle ground between childhood and the encroaching complexities of being a teenager. You are too old to believe in the bedtime stories of monsters under the bed, yet you are still young enough for the shadows to feel like they have teeth, and for the silence of an empty hallway to feel like a held breath. Those extra classes were a necessity my parents insisted upon. They were ambitious for me, obsessed with the idea of me staying ahead of the curve in a world they perceived as increasingly competitive. But to me, those hours were a sentence. I would sit in those overheated classrooms, the radiator clanking and hissing like a restless beast in the corner. The smell of floor wax, old paper, and the damp wool of 20 children's coats would become thick and suffocating. I spent most of those hours watching the window, tracing the frost as it crawled across the glass, watching as the horizon slowly swallowed the last sliver of gray light. I knew what waited for me outside, the long, cold journey home. The school sat on a hill, surrounded by trees that, in the winter, looked like skeletons reaching out of the earth to claw at the sky. When the classes finally ended and we were released, the air outside would hit us like a physical blow. It was a dry, stinging cold that turned your skin red and made every breath feel like you were inhaling tiny shards of glass. The only thing that made it manageable, the only thing that kept my feet moving when the wind howled through those skeletal trees, was Bethany. Bethany was my best friend in the way only a childhood friend can be. She was the anchor to my drifting ship. She had a laugh that was loud and unrefined, a sound that could cut through even the thickest winter fog, and remind you that you were still human, still alive. She lived just a few blocks from the school, but her route home coincided with mine for the first 20 minutes of the journey. To an outsider, we must have looked like two small, bundled-up shapes, unrecognizable in our heavy parkas and thick scarves, scuttling through the dark like frightened mice. But to us, we were an army of two. We had developed a ritual over the months, As soon as we stepped out of the heavy oak school doors and into the biting air, we would start talking. It was a desperate, non-stop stream of consciousness. We talked about everything and nothing. The mundane details of our lives served as a shield. We dissected the day's lessons with the sharp, unearned cynicism of preteens. We whispered about which boys in our class were the most annoying, which teachers were secretly robots, and what we hoped to find in our lunchboxes the next day. We'd stretch those conversations as long as possible. We'd walk with exaggeratedly slow steps, our voices rising in pitch and volume as we neared the point where we had to part. It was as if we believed the sheer decibel level of our chatter could create a physical barrier, a dome of sound that the encroaching night could not penetrate. As long as we were talking, the shadows stayed back. As long as we were laughing, the winter couldn't touch our hearts. I remember the way our breath would hitch in the air, forming tiny ghostly clouds that vanished as quickly as they appeared. We'd play games to pass the time, counting the number of yellow windows we passed, trying to guess what the families inside were having for dinner. We'd try to see who could keep their balance on the frozen, slippery curb for the longest stretch without falling into the lava of the street. We were desperate to anchor ourselves to the mundane, to the human world of warm living rooms and glowing televisions that we could glimpse through the narrow gaps in people's heavy curtains. Those glimpses were like flickers of another dimension, a world where it was always warm and where the dark stayed outside. But the geography of our neighborhood was a cruel one, designed by some architect who understood the nature of isolation. No matter how much we slowed our pace, no matter how many times we doubled back to check a sound or stood under the rare flickering orange of a streetlight to finish a particularly long story, we always reached the inevitable end of our shared path. Bethany's house always came first. I can still see it in my mind's eye with a clarity that hurts. It was a modest, two-story house with white siding that looked blue in the moonlight. I remember the warm amber glow of her porch light, a beacon of safety in the vast, cold ocean of the night. I could often see the silhouette of her mother moving behind the kitchen window, the inviting, spectral smell of wood smoke drifting from their chimney. It was more than just a house, it was a sanctuary. Every night the scene was the same. Bethany would reach the edge of her driveway, and for a heartbeat, we would both go silent. The weight of what came next would settle over us. She would give me a final sympathetic wave, her eyes reflecting the porch light. "See you tomorrow," she'd yell, her voice already sounding distant as she hurried toward her front door. I would stand there for a moment, watching as she disappeared inside. I would hear the heavy thud of her front door closing, followed by the unmistakable click of the lock. And in that instant, the warmth of our friendship, the shield of our shared laughter, would evaporate. The cold would return with a vengeance, sinking directly through my clothes, through my skin, and into my very marrow. And then, there was only the silence. Mine was still another 10 to 15 minutes ahead. In the grand scheme of a human life, 10 minutes is nothing. It is a blip. A moment spent waiting for a bus or a commercial break. But in the winter, in the pitch-black heart of a neighborhood that seemed to be forgetting you existed, those 10 minutes felt like a slow crawl through a nightmare. That last stretch was the problem. It wasn't a path meant for people. It was a shortcut, a remnant of a neighborhood that hadn't quite finished its evolution. To get to my street, I had to pass through the alley. I remember the path too clearly, even though I haven't stepped foot near that place for over 20 years. I suspect that if I were to be blinded tomorrow, I could still navigate it by the sheer visceral memory of the fear it inspired. It was a small, narrow alleyway, squeezed between broken, crumbling brick walls that felt like they were leaning in, slowly exhaling the dust of a century. On either side, overgrown bushes and wild hedges, their leaves long dead and brittle, their branches twisted like the arthritic fingers of a buried giant, pushed through the cracks. In the stone, there were no streetlights here. For reasons known only to the city's planning department, the infrastructure simply gave up at the mouth of the alley. The orange glow of the residential streets faded behind me, replaced by a deep, velvety gloom that the moonlight struggled to penetrate. There were no signs of people, no distant sounds of car engines, no barking dogs. There were no houses close enough to hear you even if you screamed with the full, desperate force of your lungs. It was a straight, silent corridor of shadows that felt like it had been carved out of the world and forgotten. Every single time I walked through it, the alley felt longer. It was as if the space itself were elastic, stretching out as I stepped into its center, making the exit point seem miles away. I would count my steps, trying to maintain a steady military rhythm to keep my mind focused. 1, 2, 3, 4, but the silence was never truly silent. It was a heavy, pressurized thing, a thick silence that made my ears ring and my skin crawl. It felt like the air was listening. I would hold my flashlight like a holy relic, a weapon against the unseen. It was a cheap, plastic thing my father had given me. The light had cast a sickly, flickering yellow that barely managed to cut through 3 feet of the gloom. I would aim the beam strictly at the ground, terrified that if I lifted the light, I would see something the darkness had been hiding just out of reach, something crouching on the walls or hanging from the twisted branches. The walls were the worst part. In the daylight, I'm sure they were just old bricks and mortar, but at night, they looked like the skin of something ancient, vast, and dying. Moss hung from the crevices in wet black clumps that looked like matted hair. The bushes would rustle even when there was no wind, a dry, papery sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. I would imagine eyes in every knot of wood, teeth in every jagged stone. I used to tell myself that I was being brave. I would hum songs under my breath, mostly nursery rhymes or pop songs I'd heard on the radio, or I would recite my multiplication tables in a frantic whisper. 7 times 7 is 49. 8 times 8 is 64. Anything to keep my mind from wandering into the what-ifs. What if someone is standing behind that overgrown hedge, just waiting for the light to pass? What if the path doesn't end this time? What if something is watching me from the broken dark windows of the old warehouse that bordered the far end? I never told my parents how much I hated that walk. I was a child of the 90s, raised with a certain expectation of independence. I didn't want to seem like a baby, and I certainly didn't want to lose the small bit of autonomy I felt I had earned by being grown up enough to walk home alone. My father would talk about his own childhood, about walking miles through snowdrifts, and I didn't want to disappoint him. But every night, as I stepped into that alleyway after leaving the safety of Bethany's porch, a part of me died. A part of me became convinced that I was no longer in the world of schoolbooks and dinner tables. I was in a place between places, a dark, narrow vein of the earth where the rules of the sun no longer applied. I knew every crack in that pavement. I knew the exact spot where the wall dipped and the bushes became a tangled, impenetrable mess. I knew the sound of my own footsteps, how they echoed differently, more hollowly, when I passed the rusted iron gate that led to a forgotten garden. I lived that walk 1,000 times in my head before I ever took it, rehearsing my survival, and yet, nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for the day the silence finally decided to speak back. That day started like any other Tuesday. The school day had been long and tedious. The math teacher had spent the entire afternoon droning on about fractions, while I stared at the clock, watching the second hand crawl. Bethany and I had laughed until our sides ached during our walk, making fun of a particularly ridiculous school assembly. But the moment she stepped inside her house and the click of her lock echoed through the freezing street, I felt a shift. It wasn't just the cold, though the temperature seemed to have plummeted 10 degrees in a matter of seconds. It was the weight of the air. It felt thick, heavy, like I was walking through water. I stood at the threshold of the alley, my heart already beginning its familiar frantic drumbeat against my ribs, a rhythm of pure, unadulterated dread. I adjusted the straps of my heavy backpack, gripped the cold plastic of my flashlight until my knuckles were white and aching, and stepped into the dark. I didn't know it then, but the longest stretch was no longer just a path home. It was about to become a permanent, jagged part of my soul. I took my first step into the alley, the light of the street behind me fading, and for the first time in my life, I felt the darkness reach back. The transition from the residential street to the mouth of the alley was like crossing an invisible border between two different worlds. Behind me lay the world of electricity, of brick and mortar homes, and the faint, comforting sounds of families settling in for the evening. Ahead of me lay the void. The orange glow of the last functional streetlight on the corner stretched out in a long, desperate finger of light, but it couldn't penetrate the heavy, velvety darkness of the shortcut. As I took those first few steps, the temperature didn't just drop, it seemed to change quality. It was no longer just the atmospheric cold of a winter evening. It was a stagnant, ancient chill that felt like it was radiating from the very walls of the alley itself. In the previous chapter of my life, I might have called it my imagination, but as a 12-year-old girl clutching a cheap plastic flashlight, I knew better. I could feel it in the way the air sat still around me, heavy and pressurized, like the atmosphere at the bottom of a deep, dark lake. I adjusted my backpack, the straps digging into my shoulders through the layers of my parka, and clicked on my flashlight. The beam was a pathetic, jaundiced yellow, struggling to illuminate the cracked pavement beneath my feet. I forced myself to walk, my boots making a dry, crunching sound on the frozen dirt and gravel. Left, right, left, right. I tried to keep a steady rhythm, a cadence of normalcy to anchor my racing heart. But something was fundamentally wrong. I'd walked this path hundreds of times, yet tonight, the proportions felt skewed. The walls of the crumbling brick buildings on either side seemed higher, their jagged silhouettes cutting into the starless sky like the teeth of a saw. The overgrown bushes, usually just a nuisance that snagged my clothes, now looked like crouching figures, their leafless branches poised to reach out and pull me into the shadows. I was perhaps 50 yards into the stretch when I first heard it. It started as a faint vibration in the air, a sound so soft I thought it might be the wind whistling through the gaps in the brickwork. But there was no wind. The air was as still as a tomb. I slowed my pace, my breath coming in short, visible puffs of white mist. I held my breath, straining my ears, my thumb hovering over the flashlight switch, as if the light itself were a shield. Then it came again, clearer this time. A sob. It was the sound of a girl crying. But it wasn't the kind of crying I was used to hearing on the school playground. It wasn't the loud, attention-seeking wail of a child who had scraped their knee. This was something different. It was restless. It was desperate. It was the kind of sobbing that sounded like it had been going on for an eternity and would never find the relief of a breath. It was a breathless, rhythmic heaving that seemed to pulse from the very shadows themselves. I stopped dead in my tracks. My heart was no longer just beating. It was thundering, a frantic, rhythmic percussion that I was sure must be audible in the oppressive silence. I tilted my head, trying to triangulate the source. It sounded like it was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. It echoed off the narrow walls, distorting the direction, making it seem as if the crying girl were standing right beside me, yet hidden by a veil of shadow. "Hello?" I whispered. My voice was a thin, fragile thing that was immediately swallowed by the gloom. No response, just the crying. It grew louder, more frantic. It sounded like a girl who had lost everything. A girl who was drowning in her own sorrow. Every instinct I possessed, the primal lizard brain part of my mind, screamed at me to run. It told me that this sound was a trap, a lure meant to draw me deeper into the darkness. But another part of me, the part that was still a child, felt a surge of confused empathy. What if someone was really hurt? What if a girl my age was trapped in the overgrown bushes, unable to find her way out? I took a tentative step forward. The moment my boot hit the ground, the crying escalated. It became sharper, more jagged. It wasn't just a sob anymore, it was a sequence of gasping, wheezing inhalations that sounded like someone struggling for air. I began to walk faster. I didn't want to be a hero, I just wanted the sound to stop. I wanted to reach the end of the alley, to see the lights of my own street, to feel the safety of my front porch. But the faster I moved, the more the sound seemed to track me. It didn't stay behind me. It moved along the walls, staying perfectly level with my pace. The panic began to set in, a cold, oily slick that coated my thoughts. I started to jog, my backpack bouncing rhythmically against my spine. The yellow beam of my flashlight danced wildly across the path, illuminating patches of gray stone and black moss. The crying was now a constant roar in my ears. It was hysterical. It was the sound of a mind unraveling. I was halfway through the alley, the longest stretch, and the exit seemed further away than ever. The walls felt like they were leaning in closer, the path narrowing until I felt like I was being squeezed. The crying was so loud now that I could hear the wetness of it, the sound of tears hitting the cold ground, the sound of a throat raw from screaming. "Stop it," I shouted, the words tearing out of my throat. "Stop it." I skidded to a halt, my boots sliding on a patch of ice. I couldn't take another step. The sound was too much. It was vibrating in my chest, shaking my very soul. I had to know. I had to see. With a shaking hand, I gripped the flashlight tightly. My fingers were numb with cold and terror. I took a deep breath, counting to 3 in my head. 1, 2, 3. I spun around, swinging the beam of the flashlight in a wide, desperate arc behind me. The light cut through the darkness, illuminating the path I had just traversed. I saw the cracked pavement. I saw the crumbling brick walls. I saw the tangled skeletal branches of the bushes. The alley was empty. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the crying. It was instantaneous. 1 second, the air was filled with the frantic, hysterical wailing of a ghost. The next, there was absolutely nothing. No echo. No lingering vibration. Just the sound of my own ragged, terrified breathing, and the faint, distant hum of the city that seemed a million miles away. I swept the light back and forth, my arm trembling so violently that the beam stuttered across the stone. Nothing. No footprints in the thin layer of frost. No movement in the shadows. The girl, whoever or whatever she was, had vanished as if she had never existed. I stood there for what felt like hours, though it could have only been seconds. My mind was racing, trying to find a logical explanation. A recording? A trick of the wind? A prank by some older kids? But I knew the truth. No recording could sound that raw, that visceral. No wind could hold its breath like that. The off feeling I had sensed at the mouth of the alley had now intensified into a crushing weight. The silence wasn't empty, it was full. It was expectant. It felt like something was standing just outside the reach of my yellow light, watching me, waiting for me to turn back around. I didn't turn back. I couldn't. I backed away slowly, keeping the light pointed at the empty alley behind me. My heart was still a frantic drum, and my breath was coming in short, sharp gasps. I moved like a ghost myself, stepping carefully, terrified that even the slightest sound would bring the crying back. The exit of the alley finally came into view, a rectangle of dim gray light where the residential street began. I didn't wait. As soon as I reached the threshold, I turned and ran. I ran until my lungs burned, until the cold air felt like fire in my throat, until I reached the safety of my own front door. I burst into the house, slamming the door behind me and leaning my back against it, my chest heaving. My mother was in the kitchen, the familiar clink of silverware providing a jarring contrast to the nightmare I had just left. "Is that you, honey?" she called out, her voice warm and mundane. I couldn't answer. I just stood there in the hallway, the yellow flashlight still clutched in my hand, staring at the door. I could still feel the pressure of the silence in the alley. I could still hear the ghost of that sobbing in the back of my mind. I didn't know it then, but the crying wasn't the end. It was just the introduction. The silence hadn't been an absence of sound, it had been a stage being set. And as I stood there in the safety of my home, I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that whatever had been crying in the dark was no longer in the alley. It was waiting for the next time I had to walk the longest stretch. It was waiting for me to recognize the face behind the tears. The human mind possesses a remarkable, almost desperate capacity for denial. After the incident with the sobbing in the dark, I spent the following day in a state of suspended animation. In the bright, fluorescent-lit halls of my school, the memory of the alley felt like a fever dream, something that happened to a different version of me, in a different reality. And argue about television shows, and for a few hours, I managed to convince myself that the terror I had felt was merely the product of an overactive imagination fueled by the winter gloom. But as the clock in my final period ticked toward 4:30 p.m., the denial began to crumble. The sky outside the window was already beginning its descent into that familiar, bruised purple. The radiator in the classroom hissed, a sound that now reminded me of the shallow, ragged breathing of the girl in the dark. By the time the bell rang, the dread had returned, settling in the pit of my stomach like a cold stone. Bethany was her usual bubbly self. She talked about a new movie she wanted to see, oblivious to the fact that I was barely answering. I walked beside her, my eyes scanning every shadow, every dark doorway we passed. I was no longer an army of two, I was a soldier waiting for an ambush. When we reached her house, the parting felt different. It felt final. As her front door clicked shut, the silence of the street rushed in to meet me, heavy and suffocating. I stood at the mouth of the alley for what felt like an eternity. My flashlight was gripped so tightly in my hand that my palm ached. I could have taken the long way around, adding 20 minutes to my journey. But a strange, morbid compulsion drew me toward the shortcut. I needed to know if the sound would come back. I needed to prove to myself that the alley was just an alley. I stepped into the darkness. The air was even colder than the night before, a dry, crystalline frost that seemed to hang in the air like dust. My boots made a rhythmic crunch on the frozen ground. I didn't hum today. I didn't recite multiplication tables. I simply walked, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I reached the halfway point, the spot where the crying had started. I stopped, holding my breath. The silence was absolute. No sobbing, no wind, just the sound of the blood rushing in my ears. I felt a surge of relief, a moment of triumph. See? I thought. It was nothing. Just the wind, just a trick of the light. I took another step, ready to run the rest of the way, when I felt it. It wasn't a sound. It was a pressure. A sudden displacement of air, as if something large had moved silently into the space directly in front of me. I froze. My flashlight was pointed at the ground, casting a small, circular pool of yellow light around my boots. I didn't want to look up. Every cell in my body was screaming at me to keep my eyes down, to turn around, to vanish. But my hand moved on its own. Slowly, as if through thick molasses, I raised the beam of the flashlight. She was just there. There were no footsteps, no rustle of fabric, no warning. One moment, the path ahead was empty, a void of gray stone and black shadow. The next, she was standing less than 3 feet away from me, fully illuminated by the jaundiced light of my torch. My breath hitched in my throat, a sharp, cold gasp that felt like it was tearing my lungs. I wanted to scream, but my throat had turned to stone. I wanted to run, but my legs were rooted to the spot, heavy and unresponsive as if they were part of the pavement itself. I stood there, a 12-year-old girl paralyzed by a sight that defied every law of nature and biology I had ever been taught. The first thing I noticed was her height. She was short, barely taller than a child of my own age, but there was nothing childlike about her. She stood with a hunched predatory posture, her body unnaturally narrow, as if her ribs had been crushed inward and never properly healed. Her limbs were the stuff of nightmares, thin, spindly, and impossibly long. Her arms hung down past her knees, the skin stretched tight over the bone like wet parchment. Her fingers were like needles, elongated and twitching with a life of their own. She was wrapped in something that looked like fabric, but as I looked closer, I realized it was part of her. It was a torn, translucent membrane, a grayish-white material that hung off her in tatters. It looked like wings that had rotted and fused into her back, the delicate veins within them visible in the harsh light. They weren't the majestic wings of a bird, or even the leathery wings of a bat. They were the ruined parasitic appendages of an insect that had spent centuries in the dark. But it was her face that truly shattered my sanity. Her head was slightly too large for her narrow neck, tilted at an awkward, inquisitive angle. Her skin was the color of a fish's belly, a pale, translucent white that seemed to shimmer with a faint, oily sheen. Her eyes were small, sunken deep into the caverns of her skull, but they caught the light of my flashlight with a terrifying, intelligent intensity. They weren't human eyes. They were the eyes of a collector, cold and calculating. And then there was her mouth. It was a jagged, uneven slit that stretched from ear to ear, the corners split open as if they had been forced apart by something far too large for her face. Her lips were thin, pale, and constantly wet. Even as I watched, she began to lick them, a slow, rhythmic motion of a gray, pointed tongue that emerged and vanished in a heartbeat. As she stared into my eyes, her mouth began to stretch wider. It wasn't a smile, it was an unfolding. She pulled her lips back, revealing her teeth. I had never seen anything so horrific. They were a chaotic, crowded mosaic of bone. Some were sharp and needle-like, others were blunt and yellowed with age. They were of all different sizes and shapes, and as the light hit them, I realized with a jolt of pure visceral horror that they didn't belong to her. They were embedded into her gums unevenly, some pushed so deep they seemed to be coming out of the roof of her mouth, others hanging by threads of pale flesh. It looked like she had taken a handful of mismatched teeth and hammered them into her own jaw. There were the small, pearly teeth of children, the soft ones, and the heavy, grounded molars of adults. They were a collection, a trophy room of ivory and pain. The smell hit me then. It wasn't the smell of rot or decay, though there was a hint of that. It was the smell of a dentist's office, metallic, sterile, and cold, mixed with the earthy, damp scent of a fresh grave. For a long, agonizing minute, neither of us moved. I could hear the faint, high-pitched whine of the flashlight's batteries. I could hear the sound of her wet lips clicking as she continued to lick them. She seemed to be feeding on my fear, savoring the way my body trembled, the way my eyes widened until they felt like they would burst. She wasn't a ghost. She was a physical entity, a solid thing of flesh and bone and stolen teeth, standing in a derelict alley in the middle of a winter night. The reality of her presence was more terrifying than any phantom could ever be. She was an aberration, a glitch in the world that had decided to manifest itself right in front of me. My mind raced, trying to find a name for her. My parents had told me stories of the Tooth Fairy, a benevolent being who traded coins for bone. But this was the truth behind the myth. This was the collector who didn't wait for the teeth to fall out. This was the thing that lived in the dark spaces between the streetlights, waiting for the children who walked the longest stretch alone. I realized then that I wasn't just looking at a monster, I was looking at a predator that had been watching me for a long time. She knew my name. She knew my walk. She had been waiting for the moment when Bethany's door closed, and I was truly, completely alone. The flashlight in my hand flickered. My heart skipped a beat. I knew that if the light went out, I would be lost. The darkness of the alley was her territory, and she was merely humoring me by standing in the yellow circle of my torch. I tried to find my voice. I wanted to ask her what she wanted, to plead for my life, to scream for my mother. But when I finally managed to open my mouth, no sound came out. My throat was as dry as the winter air, my tongue thick and useless. She tilted her head again, a bird-like movement that made her neck crack audibly in the silence. Her sunken eyes locked onto mine, and for a fleeting second, I saw a flicker of something that looked like amusement. She knew she had me. She knew that there was no one to hear me, no one to save me. The silence of the alley seemed to tighten around us. The walls felt closer, the shadows deeper. The ruined wings on her back twitched, a dry, papery sound that made me want to vomit. She was beautiful in a way that only death can be, perfectly designed for her singular, horrific purpose. I realized that I was standing on the precipice of something I could never come back from. If I survived this night, I would never be the same girl again. I would never look at a dark room the same way. I would never trust the safety of my own home. I was being initiated into a world of shadows, and the Tooth Fairy was my guide. Then, she spoke. Her voice wasn't a single sound. It was a discordant, layered whisper that seemed to come from all around me. It sounded like dozens of people speaking at once, their voices out of sync and distorted. It was hoarse, rattling, and followed by a sound that I can only describe as an awkward, clicking giggle. "Do you recognize me?" She whispered, the words slurring over her mismatched teeth. "I'm the Tooth Fairy." The irony of her words was a physical blow. The childhood story, the comfort of the coin under the pillow, it was all a mask for this. She wasn't here to give me anything. She was here to take. "Do you have any tooth for me?" she asked, her voice rising into a hysterical, rhythmic laughter that made my skin crawl. She began to move, Not a step, but a glide, her long limbs moving with a fluid insectoid grace. She was coming closer, the circle of light from my flashlight shrinking as she entered its space. The smell of the dentist's office and the grave grew overpowering. I watched, frozen in a state of pure crystalline terror, as she reached out one of her needle-like fingers. The nail was long, yellowed and sharp. She pointed it directly at my face, her wide, split mouth trembling with anticipation. The longest stretch was no longer a path home. It was a hunting ground, and the hunt had officially begun. The silence of the alley was no longer empty. It had become a vessel for a sound so unnatural, so fundamentally broken, that it felt like it was peeling back the layers of my very consciousness, exposing the raw nerves beneath. When she spoke, it wasn't just a voice reaching my ears. It was a physical vibration that rattled my teeth in their sockets and hummed in the very marrow of my bones, as if my body were trying to harmonize with a frequency it was never meant to hear. It was a layered, discordant chorus, a cacophony of whispers, rasps, and wet clicks that sounded like a dozen people of different ages and genders, all trying to scream through a single rotting throat. I could hear the high-pitched, innocent lilt of a toddler beneath the gravelly, ancient rasp of a dying man, all of them speaking the same words in a terrifying, out-of-sync unison. "Do you recognize me?" she had asked. I stood there, the flashlight trembling so violently in my hand that the beam threatened to flicker out. The yellow light danced across her pale fish belly skin, highlighting the translucent quality of her flesh, where the veins pulsed with a dark, sluggish rhythm. I couldn't move. I couldn't even blink. The air between us felt thick and ionized, charged with a static that made the fine hairs on my arms stand straight up, pulling at my skin. The smell of the dentist's office, that sharp, metallic scent of sterile tools, latex and fluoride, was now so overpowering it made my eyes water, mixing with the cloying, sweet stench of old earth and the metallic tang of dried blood. It was the scent of a sanitized grave. "I'm the tooth fairy," she repeated, her head tilting so far to the side that I heard the wet pop of her vertebrae. The words were followed by that awkward clicking giggle. It was a rhythmic, mechanical sound, like two stones being struck together deep inside her chest cavity. But then, the giggle began to morph. It stretched and warped, the different voices in her throat competing for dominance, growing in volume until it was a full-blown hysterical laughter. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated madness, an acoustic representation of a mind that had been fractured for centuries. It didn't have the warmth of human joy. It was the sound of something that had forgotten what it was like to be alive, something that had spent an eternity in the damp dark, feeding on secrets, shadows, and bone. As she laughed, her wide split mouth quivered with a grotesque elasticity. I could see the mismatched teeth, the trophies of 1,000 harvests, vibrating in her pale, receded gums. Some of them looked terrifyingly loose, swaying precariously as she shook with mirth. I watched, mesmerized by the sheer biological wrongness of it, as a small pearly incisor, a child's tooth, still white and perfect, fell from her upper jaw. It hit the frozen ground with a tiny, sharp clink that seemed to echo louder than the laughter itself. She didn't seem to notice or care. She simply ground her remaining teeth together, a sound like gravel in a blender, and kept laughing. Her sunken eyes were locked onto mine with a predatory intensity that felt like a physical weight pressing against my chest, stealing the air before I could even draw it. "Do you have any tooth for me?" she whispered, her voice suddenly dropping from the hysterical heights to a low, intimate rasp. It felt like a secret being hissed directly into the folds of my brain, a cold breath against my psyche, even though she was still feet away. I tried to find my voice. My mind was screaming, "Run, run, run," until my legs gave out, but my body was a traitor, a statue of flesh and bone anchored to the spot by a fear so absolute it had bypassed my fight-or-flight response and settled into a state of total paralysis. I was a rabbit caught in the gaze of a cobra, waiting for the inevitable strike. I managed to stammer, the words barely audible over the frantic, irregular thumping of my heart. My tongue felt like a lead weight, thick and useless in a mouth that had suddenly gone bone dry. "I collect them," she said, cutting through my stammer with the sharp finality of a guillotine. She began to move toward me, not with a human gait, but with a series of jerky insectoid glides. Her long, spindly limbs moved with a fluid, terrifying grace that was entirely at odds with her hunched, broken posture. Each movement was accompanied by the sound of dry parchment rubbing together, the ruined, translucent wings on her back twitching and rustling in anticipation. "The small ones," she continued, her layered voice shimmering with a sickening kind of avarice. "The soft ones. The ones that are white and pure, before the rot of time and the bitterness of age gets to them. The ones that fall out in the night, placed with such hope under pillows for a coin that never truly pays for the piece of themselves they've lost. They think it's a trade. They don't realize it's a harvest." She was closer now, entering the primary circle of my flashlight's beam. The world outside that yellow circle ceased to exist. I could see the fine spiderweb cracks in her pale lips, and the way they were perpetually wet, a thin string of translucent saliva stretching between her jaws. The smell of the grave was no longer a scent, it was a wall, thick, heavy, and suffocating, coating the back of my throat with the taste of copper and dust. "I take them because they are memories," she hissed, her needle-like fingers twitching, the long, yellowed nails clicking against one another like the legs of a beetle. "Every tooth is a piece of a life, a crystallized moment of childhood. I build myself from them. I fill the yawning holes in my own jaw with the stolen vitality of children who walk where they shouldn't, who linger in the shadows long after the sun has fled. Do you see? Do you see how many stories I carry?" She pulled her lips back even further, an impossible feat of anatomy that caused the corners of her mouth to tear, fresh beads of dark, thick fluid welling up and running down her chin. I saw the tiers of teeth, rows upon rows of them, some pushed into the roof of her mouth like stalactites, others protruding at jagged angles from the sides of her gums. It was a graveyard of ivory, a chaotic monument to her eternal hunger. "I've been watching you, little one," she whispered, her voice becoming a singular, terrifying roar that seemed to emanate from the walls of the alley itself. "I've watched you walk this path with your friend, clinging to her like a shield. I've heard your laughter, so bright and fragile. I've smelled the sweetness of your youth, the scent of a tooth just beginning to loosen in its socket. And I've been waiting, counting your steps, waiting for the moment your fear would ripen, making your teeth ready for my collection." A wave of violent nausea rolled over me, my stomach churning with the realization that this creature, this aberration of myth and nightmare, had been a silent passenger in my life. She had been there in the periphery of every winter walk, a shadow among shadows, calculating the exact moment I would be truly, completely alone. My mind flashed back to every time I had felt a sudden chill in this alley, every time I had felt the inexplicable urge to run without knowing why. She had always been there, just inches outside the light. "I collect them," she repeated, her voice rising again into that hysterical, rhythmic laughter that felt like needles under my fingernails. "And today, I think I'll start with yours. I'll take the ones in front first, so I can see you try to smile without them." The laughter reached a crescendo, a wall of discordant sound that seemed to vibrate the very bricks of the alley walls, causing dust to shake free from the mortar. It was a sonic assault that made my head throb with a blinding pain. And then, as quickly as it had begun, it stopped. The silence that followed was a vacuum, a predatory stillness that indicated the end of the psychological game. She lunged. It happened with a speed that defied human perception. My brain couldn't register the transition from stillness to motion. One moment she was standing 5 feet away, and the next, the air was violently displaced. Her long, cold fingers, thin as wire, but possessing the crushing strength of industrial iron, wrapped themselves around my throat with a sickening wet thud. The impact of her hands knocked the flashlight from my grip. I watched, as if suspended in a nightmare's slow motion, as the plastic tube hit the ground and rolled away. Its yellow beam spun wildly across the crumbling walls, illuminating flashes of moss and cracked brick, before coming to rest 10 feet away, its light pointing uselessly toward the mouth of the alley. I was in the dark now, trapped in the freezing shadow with the collector. Her grip was agonizing, a concentrated pressure that felt like it would snap my neck like a dry twig. I could feel the sharp, yellowed nails piercing the soft skin of my throat, drawing heat from my body as blood began to trickle down my collar. My airway was crushed instantly. I tried to gasp, to pull in a single, life-saving breath of the freezing winter air, but there was only a hollow, wheezing sound. Only the pressure. Only the cold. I clawed at her hands, my small fingers scratching desperately at her pale, translucent skin. It felt like touching wet, refrigerated parchment stretched over cold marble. She didn't flinch. She didn't even seem to feel my struggle. She just stood there, her face hovering inches from mine, her wide split mouth trembling with a sick, erotic anticipation. Her sunken eyes were wide and vacant, yet they reflected the distant dying light of the fallen flashlight like twin shards of obsidian. "The soft ones," she whispered, her breath smelling of ancient copper and antiseptic. It was a wet, clicking sound against my cheek, a sound that carried the weight of a death sentence. The ones that are still rooted deep in the warm red, they taste the best. They hold the most memory. My vision began to fracture. Dark, oily spots danced before my eyes, swirling like black ink dropped into clear water. My heart was a frantic dying drum in my ears, a stuttering thump-thump, thump-thump, thump, as it struggled to pump oxygen that wasn't there. My lungs were a furnace of screaming pain, a fire burning in my chest that I couldn't extinguish, no matter how hard I tried to swallow the void. I kicked out blindly with my boots, my legs growing heavy and unresponsive as my nervous system began to flicker and fail. The alley began to tilt and rotate. The crumbling walls and the skeletal, reaching bushes blurred into a single undulating mass of shadow. I felt my knees hit the frozen ground, a distant sensation that didn't even register as pain. I felt the absolute cold of the earth seeping into my bones, merging with the icy grip of her hands. Her face was the final image burned into my retinas. She leaned in even closer, her split mouth opening to an impossible width, the mosaic of stolen teeth gleaming with a dull, wet luster in the shadows. She looked like she was going to inhale my very soul, or perhaps she was just savoring the exact microsecond my spirit would break, so she could begin the harvest of my jaw. The darkness wasn't just surrounding me anymore. It was an invasive force, filling my head, drowning my thoughts, and extinguishing the last flickering embers of my consciousness. Mom, Dad, Bethany, their names were fading echoes in an expanding void, symbols of a world I was no longer a part of. The pressure on my neck was the only reality left, a singular point of existence. And then, even that began to dissolve into a numbing gray. The world didn't end with a bang or a final scream. It ended with the sound of a layered, discordant giggle and the sensation of cold, needle-like fingers tightening one last, definitive time. The blackness took me completely. I wasn't a girl in an alley anymore. I was a void within a void, a memory in the dark, waiting to be cataloged and kept. The return to consciousness was not a gentle awakening. It was a violent re-entry, like being hauled upward from the bottom of a dark, pressurized ocean and breaking the surface with lungs that had forgotten how to process oxygen. For a long, terrifying minute, I existed in a sensory vacuum. The blackness of the alley, the cold wire of those fingers, and the smell of the grave still clung to the insides of my eyelids. I expected to feel the frozen ground beneath my cheek and the suffocating weight of the collector's presence. Instead, I felt the soft, familiar scratch of cotton sheets. I didn't open my eyes immediately. I was too afraid of what I would see. I waited for the discordant giggle to shatter the silence, or for the needle-like nails to resume their harvest of my throat. But the silence that greeted me was different from the silence of the alley. It wasn't predatory or expectant. It was heavy with the mundane sounds of a sleeping house. The distant hum of the refrigerator, the faint ticking of a clock, and the rhythmic thrum of something moving above me. I forced my eyes open. Above me, the three blades of the ceiling fan spun in a slow, hypnotic circle. The motor emitted a low, consistent groan that I had heard every night of my childhood. I was in my bedroom. The walls, painted a soft, dusty blue, were illuminated by the pale, artificial glow of the street lamp outside my window, the very light I had been so desperately running toward. My posters were still there, my books were neatly stacked on the shelf, and my school bag lay slumped in the corner like a discarded shell. For several seconds, I didn't move. I lay perfectly still, my limbs feeling heavy and disconnected, as if my soul hadn't quite finished reoccupying my body. My mind was a chaotic storm of contradictions. My environment told me I was safe, in the heart of my sanctuary, but my body told a different story. I was shivering, but not from the cold of the room. It was a deep, internal tremor that started in my chest and radiated outward to my fingertips. My throat was on fire. Every swallow was an act of agony, a reminder of the pressure that had crushed my airway. I could still feel the phantom sensation of those cold fingers set a lingering weight around my neck that made me feel like I was still being choked. "Mom!" I tried to scream, but the word came out as a broken, aspirated rasp. I tried again, pushing the air through my damaged throat with everything I had. "Mom! Dad!" The sound of my own voice, so thin and ruined, terrified me more than the silence had. I heard footsteps in the hallway. Heavy, hurried thuds that signaled my father's approach, followed by the lighter, frantic gait of my mother. They burst through the door, their faces pale and etched with alarm, their pajamas a jarringly normal sight against the backdrop of my lingering terror. "What is it? What happened?" my mother cried, rushing to the side of the bed and reaching out to touch my forehead. Her hand was warm, too warm, and I flinched away from her touch, my mind still identifying any contact as a threat. I sat up quickly, the movement sending a wave of nausea through my stomach. My head throbbed with the rhythm of my pulse. I grabbed at my mother's sleeve, my fingers trembling so violently I could barely hold on. "How did I get here?" I gasped, my words rushed and uneven. "The alley, the girl, the tooth fairy. She grabbed me, Mom. She wouldn't let go." I couldn't breathe. "Slow down, honey," my father said, his voice deep and anchoring. He stood at the foot of the bed, his arms crossed over his chest, his brow furrowed in a look of deep concern that I would later recognize as a precursor to skepticism. "You're safe. You're in your room." "But how?" I demanded, my voice rising into a frantic, jagged pitch. The last thing I remember, I was in the alley. It was dark, and she was right there. She had these wings, like rotted fabric, and her mouth, it was split open, and she had all these teeth, hundreds of them, pushed into her gums. She said she was the tooth fairy. She choked me. Everything went black. I told them everything. I poured out the details with a desperate intensity, repeating the descriptions of the creature's fish belly skin, the discordant, layered voices, and the smell of the dentist's office mixed with the grave. I spoke until my throat felt like it was bleeding, until my lungs burned, until I had no more words left. I needed them to understand. I needed them to acknowledge the breach in the world. I needed them to tell me how I had been transported from the cold, frozen ground of the shortcut to the safety of my bed. They looked at each other. It was a long, silent exchange, the kind of look parents give each other when they are deciding how to handle a crisis they don't believe in. "Sweetie," my mother said, her voice dropping into that gentle, patronizing tone that makes your skin crawl when you know you're right. You must have had a bad dream, a really, really bad nightmare. The words hit me like a physical blow. No, I whispered, shaking my head so hard it hurt. It wasn't a dream. I wasn't asleep. I was walking home from Bethany's. I have my bag. I have my coat. You walked in the door 20 minutes ago, my father said, his voice firm, brooking no argument. You seemed a little dazed, but you walked straight to your room. We thought you were just tired from the extra classes. You didn't say a word. You just went to bed. No, I insisted, the panic rising in my throat again. That wasn't me. I didn't walk in. I was in the alley. I was dying. It was a nightmare, honey, my mother repeated, sitting on the edge of the bed and trying to pull me into an embrace. The winter is long, and you've been working so hard at school. The mind plays tricks on you when you're exhausted. You probably fell asleep as soon as your head hit the pillow and your brain turned that walk through the alley into something scary. But my neck, I cried, pulling away and pointing at my throat. I can feel it. She choked me. Look at it. Look for the marks. My mother sighed, a sound of weary patience, and stood up. She went to the vanity and brought back a hand mirror. She held it up to my face, the silver surface reflecting the pale, frightened girl I barely recognized. I looked at my neck. The skin was pale, as it always was. And there were no purple bruises in the shape of fingers. There were no deep, jagged scratches from yellowed nails. There was nothing but smooth, unblemished flesh. I stared at my reflection, my mind reeling. I could still feel the pressure. I could still feel the sharp sting of the nails digging into my skin. The physical memory was so vivid, so visceral, that the sight of my clear skin felt like a betrayal. It was as if my own body were lying to me, conspiring with my parents to erase the truth of what had happened. See? My father said, his voice softening slightly. There's nothing there. You're okay. It was just a dream. A very vivid one, but a dream nonetheless. Go back to sleep, my mother whispered, kissing my forehead. We'll leave the hall light on for you. In the morning, this will all seem like a blurry memory. They left the room, their shadows retreating into the hallway. I heard them whispering in the kitchen, their voices a muffled drone of stress and imagination. I lay back down, but I didn't close my eyes. I stared at the ceiling fan, its slow rotation, a mockery of the stillness I felt inside. I knew it wasn't a dream. I knew the difference between the shifting, illogical landscape of sleep and the hard, cold reality of that alley. I knew the smell of that creature's breath. I knew the weight of her hands. But how had I gotten home? If my father was right, and I had walked in the door myself, then who, or what, had been piloting my body while I was unconscious? The thought was even more terrifying than the encounter itself. Had the tooth fairy let me go? Or had she followed me home, hiding inside my own skin? Sleep did not come that night. I stayed awake until the pale gray light of dawn began to bleed through the curtains, signaling the end of the longest night of my life. The days that followed were a blur of normalcy that felt entirely alien. I went to school. I talked to Bethany. I ate dinner with my parents. But the world had lost its solidity. I looked at the walls of my house and wondered if they were real, or if they were just another layer of the dream. I looked at my parents and felt a deep, aching loneliness. They were the people who were supposed to protect me, yet they had stood in my room and told me that my trauma was a fiction. They had gaslit my reality until I started to doubt my own sanity. I never walked through that alley again. I took the long way home every single day, even when it was raining, even when I was exhausted. Bethany asked me why, and I told her I just liked the scenery. I couldn't tell her the truth. I couldn't bear to see that same look of dismissive pity in her eyes. The memories didn't fade. They didn't soften. Instead, they became a shadow that followed me into adulthood. For 25 years, I lived with the secret. I grew up. I went to college. I got married. I had a daughter. I built a life on the foundation of that bad dream, always waiting for the other shoe to drop. I became a mother who was overprotective. I never let my daughter walk alone after dark. I checked her teeth every night, a habit my ex-husband found obsessive. I told myself I was just being a good parent, but I knew the truth. I was waiting. I was waiting for the tooth fairy to come back for the rest of her collection. And now, as I stood in my silent house, 25 years later, staring at the black shadow on the wall, I realized that my parents were wrong. It was never a dream, it was a promise. And today, the tooth fairy had come to collect on it. They say that time heals all wounds, but that is a platitude whispered by those who have never looked into the eyes of a monster. Time does not heal, it merely buries. It layers years of mundane concerns, bills, careers, relationships, and the white noise of a social life, over the raw, jagged edges of trauma, hoping the weight of a normal life will keep the ghosts locked in the basement. But for 25 years, I have known that my basement was never empty. I have lived my life as an architect of safety, building walls and installing redundant locks, not out of a sense of order, but out of a paralyzing cellular knowledge that the world is not what it seems. I spent my 20s obsessively researching home security systems, light-sensitive timers, and the average response times of local police departments. I didn't just want a home, I wanted a fortress where the shadows had no place to hide. I am 37 years old now. To the outside world, I am a successful woman, perhaps a bit high-strung, a bit too cautious, but ultimately functional. I have a career that keeps me busy, a house that is always brightly lit. I pay the exorbitant electricity bill with a grim sort of satisfaction, and a daughter who is the very center of my universe. She is 11 years old now, standing on that threshold between childhood and whatever comes after. She is the same age I was when I walked into that alley for the last time. She has my eyes, my stubborn streak, and, most importantly, she has her teeth. Motherhood for me has been a beautiful and terrifying form of neurosis. From the moment she was born, I became a sentinel. While other mothers worried about developmental milestones like crawling or speaking her first words, I was obsessed with the health and security of her mouth. I would spend hours staring at her gums while she slept, terrified that a tooth might loosen prematurely. I remember the first time she lost a baby tooth. It was a Tuesday morning, and while her father, Mark, was excited to play the role of the benevolent gift giver, I was gripped by a cold, sweating panic that paralyzed my limbs. I didn't want a coin under her pillow. The very thought of an exchange, a trade of bone for silver, made my skin crawl with the memory of that discordant layered giggle. I wanted that tooth in a glass jar, submerged in a preservative, locked in a heavy fireproof safe, far away from any window or doorway. I wanted to break the connection, to deny the collector her tribute. Mark used to call it my quirk, a charmingly eccentric trait of an overprotective mother. But as the years passed, that quirk, along with my refusal to let our daughter stay out past dusk, and my habit of checking every shadow in the hallway 4 times before I could even think of closing my eyes, became a wedge between us. It wasn't just a difference in parenting styles, it was a fundamental disagreement about the nature of reality. He lived in a world of statistics and safety nets. I lived in a world where fingers of translucent skin waited for the light to fail. We share custody now. It's a civil arrangement, born from the exhaustion of trying to reconcile 2 different realities. He lives in the city, in a modern apartment on the 12th floor where he believes the world is safe, logical, and governed by city ordinances. I live in the suburbs, In a house where the porch lights are on heavy-duty timers and the curtains are thick, blackout velvet that are never pulled back after 5 p.m. To him, I am the paranoid ex. To me, he is a man leaving the door wide open for a wolf he refuses to believe exists. It was winter again, the season of bruised indigo skies and early predatory darkness. The air had that familiar crystalline sharpness that always made my throat feel tight, a phantom pressure that suggested the invisible fingers of the collector were testing the strength of my memory, checking to see if I had forgotten the weight of her grip. My daughter was staying with Mark for the winter break, a 2-week stretch that always left me feeling unmoored and dangerously vulnerable. Without her in the house to protect, my own vigilance felt hollow. Without her, the silence was no longer a comfort, it was an invitation for the past to sit down beside me. The day had been a blur of professional distractions. I had spent 8 hours in back-to-back meetings, burying myself in spreadsheets and quarterly reports, trying to drown out the low-level hum of anxiety that always accompanied the winter solstice. My phone had buzzed several times throughout the morning, but I had ignored it, consumed by the desperate need to be normal, to be the woman who doesn't jump at the sound of the wind or the rattle of a heating vent. I wanted to prove to myself that I could go one full day without looking over my shoulder. It wasn't until late in the afternoon, as the sky outside my office window began its inevitable descent into that terrifying, ink-like indigo, that I finally checked my messages. The office was quiet, the hum of the computers the only companion to the rising dread in my gut. There was a text from Mark. It had been sent at 10:15 a.m., during my first meeting of the day. "Hey, just a heads up, found a great last-minute winter camp for her. She was feeling cooped up in the apartment and really wanted to go. Dropped her off this morning. She's super excited. I'll send you the info when I get to the office." I felt a slight prickle of annoyance, a heat rising in my chest. Mark was always impulsive, always trying to toughen her up or give her experiences that bypassed my restrictive rules. He saw my caution as a cage. I saw his freedom as a lack of foresight. I started to type a sharp reply, asking for the name of the camp, the staff-to-camper ratio, and the exact duration, when a second message arrived, a pinned location on a digital map. I clicked the link, the screen of my phone glowing too brightly in the dimming office. The mapping app opened, showing a small, pulsing blue dot in a residential area I hadn't thought about in years, a place I had deliberately excised from my mental geography. I pinched the screen to zoom in, my breath hitching as the names of the streets began to appear, surfacing like skeletons in a receding tide. Maple Street, 5th Avenue, Willow Lane. My heart skipped a beat, then began a slow, heavy thudding that I could feel vibrating in my inner ear. I knew these streets. I knew the geometry of this neighborhood as if I had designed it myself. I shifted the view from the clean lines of the map to the satellite mode, my fingers trembling so violently I almost dropped the phone onto the carpet. The blue dot was situated directly over a large, refurbished building, an old community center that had been converted into a trendy youth lodge for urban winter retreats. And right beside it, cutting like a jagged, blackened scar through the heart of the block, was the alley, the shortcut, the longest stretch. A wave of cold, acidic nausea washed over me, so intense I had to lean my forehead against my cold desk to keep from collapsing. It was impossible. It was a statistical anomaly that defied belief. Of all the places in the world, of all the camps Mark could have chosen, he had sent her back to the source of my nightmare. He had sent her to the very spot where the world had broken for me 25 years ago. It felt orchestrated, as if the neighborhood itself had a gravity that pulled our bloodline back toward its center. I stared at the screen, my mind reeling through 1,000 horrific scenarios. I looked at the satellite image of the alley. From the safety of a satellite's view, it looked so small, so insignificant, just a narrow strip of gray between brick buildings. But I knew its true, non-Euclidean dimensions. I knew that it was a place where space stretched like pulled taffy and time stalled into a suffocating stasis. I knew that at the center of that gray strip, there was a girl who never stopped crying and a woman with translucent wings who never stopped collecting. My phone felt like a hot coal in my hand, burning my skin with the urgency of the situation. I tried to tell myself I was overreacting. I tried to summon my mother's voice from the depths of my memory, hearing her whisper about bad dreams, overactive imaginations, and the stress of the holidays. "It's just a neighborhood," I told myself, my voice a frantic internal whisper. "It's just an old building with fresh paint. The monster isn't real. You're a grown woman with a mortgage and a life. You are safe." But the fear wasn't in my head. It was a physical infestation in my body. My throat began to ache with a sharp, localized pain. The phantom pressure of the collector's fingers returning with such visceral force that I reached up to touch my neck, half expecting to feel the cold, clammy texture of her hands or the sting of those yellowed needle-like nails. I dialed Mark's number with shaking thumbs. It went straight to voicemail after a single, mocking ring. "Mark, pick up the damn phone." I hissed into the receiver, my voice sounding like the aspirated, ruined rasp I had used 25 years ago in my bedroom. "Where is she exactly? Why the hell did you send her there? Call me back immediately or I'm calling the police." I hung up and immediately dialed my daughter's cell phone. I had insisted she have one as soon as she turned 10, primarily so I could track her GPS location and reach her at any moment of the day. The call rang once, twice, 3 times. Each ring felt like a tolling funeral bell, marking the seconds of a countdown to a catastrophe I didn't yet fully understand. "Come on, baby, pick up," I whispered, pacing the small confines of my office like a caged animal. "Please, just pick up." The call went to her voicemail, a cheerful, high-pitched recorded greeting that sounded so innocent, so full of the soft and pure life the collector craved, that it made me want to howl with grief. I looked back at the map. The sun was almost completely gone now, replaced by a deep, unforgiving blackness. The 4:30 p.m. darkness was settling over the city, and I knew that in that neighborhood, in that specific alley, the rules of the world were changing. The shadows were growing long, detaching themselves from the walls, and the off feeling would be settling into the air like a poisonous, invisible fog. I grabbed my coat and my keys, my movements frantic, uncoordinated and desperate. I didn't care about my job. I didn't care about the meetings I was missing, or the bridge I might be burning with my career. I had to get to her. I had to pull her out of that cursed place before the clock struck the hour of the collector, before the longest stretch claimed another piece of my soul. As I ran toward the elevator, the realization hit me with the force of a physical blow to the solar plexus. The Tooth Fairy hadn't let me go 25 years ago. She hadn't been satisfied with a single encounter or the terror of one small girl. She had been patient. She was an entity that operated on the scale of generations, not minutes. She had allowed me to grow up, to thrive, to heal just enough to bring another life into the world. She had waited for me to produce a new crop, a soft and pure collection that she could harvest at her leisure, using my own daughter as the ultimate prize. The cycle wasn't just repeating, it was being completed. I was the bait that had matured. I burst into the parking garage, the stagnant, cold air hitting me like a slap to the face. I fumbled with my car keys, my mind playing a horrific high-definition loop of images, the split mouth, the mosaic of stolen teeth, the translucent rotted wings. I could almost hear the discordant, layered giggle echoing off the concrete walls of the garage, bouncing between the parked cars. "She knows you," I whispered to myself, the words a cold, final realization that made my blood turn to ice. "She remembers the one that got away, and she's been hungry ever since." I pulled out of the garage, the tires screeching against the concrete with a sound like a human scream. I drove with a reckless, suicidal desperation, weaving through the late afternoon traffic, my eyes fixed on the road but my mind already miles away, standing at the mouth of that dark, narrow shortcut. I imagined her there, my daughter, perhaps looking for a bathroom or a quiet place to call home, wandering toward the bushes that looked like arthritic fingers. The winter sky was pitch black now, a void that seemed to press down on the roof of my car. The streetlights were flickering on, their orange glow casting long, distorted shadows across the asphalt that looked like reaching limbs. I looked at the digital clock on my dashboard, 5:15 p.m. She had been there for 7 hours. 7 hours in the territory of the collector. 7 hours of being watched by sunken eyes. I reached for my phone again, my thumb hovering over my daughter's name and my contacts, praying for a signal, praying for a voice, praying that the dream my parents spoke of would stay a dream for just one more night. But as I glanced at the signal bars in the corner of the screen, I saw them drop, one by one, until there was nothing but a hollow, gray, no-service icon. The silence of the car was suddenly heavy, pressurized, and expectant. The hum of the engine seemed to fade, replaced by a ringing in my ears. It was the silence of the alley. It was the silence of a held breath. And I knew, with a certainty that transcended logic or reason, that the hunt had moved from the dusty corners of my memory into the cold reality of the present. The Tooth Fairy was no longer waiting in my past. She was waiting for me to arrive at the camp. She was waiting to finish her collection, and she had used my daughter to make sure I wouldn't miss the appointment. The drive back to my house was a blurred, high-speed nightmare, a frantic struggle against a world that seemed to be actively warping around me. My tires screeched against the asphalt with a sound like a human throat tearing itself apart, and my heart was no longer just beating. It was a physical weight trying to burst through my ribs, demanding oxygen that my shallow, panicked breaths couldn't provide. I had originally intended to drive straight to the winter camp, to tear through the distance between my office and that cursed alleyway with the force of a mother's desperation. But as I reached the outskirts of my old neighborhood, a paralyzing cold realization hit me, a truth that felt like it had been carved into the back of my skull. If the Tooth Fairy was there, in that alley, she was already with my daughter. And if she was there, she was also everywhere. She was a being of shadows, and the night was her kingdom. She didn't travel by roads or obey the laws of distance. I found myself pulling into my own driveway, my hands shaking so violently I could barely turn the ignition off. The steering wheel felt slick with my own cold sweat. My house, my meticulously built fortress of light, alarms, and deadbolts, stood before me. I had spent 15 years and thousands of dollars turning this structure into a sanctuary, a place where the shadows were meant to die at the threshold, where no monster could ever find a corner deep enough to hide in. But as I stepped out of the car, the air felt fundamentally changed. It was that same stagnant, ancient chill I had first felt at age 12. The off feeling wasn't just a lingering memory of the alley, it had followed me home like a scent. It was in the very soil of my front yard, in the way the wind rattled the skeletal frozen branches of the oaks lining my street, making them sound like hundreds of thin wooden fingers tapping against the sky. I burst through the front door, slamming it behind me with such force the glass in the sidelights rattled. I engaged every bolt, the deadbolt, the chain, the reinforced latch. The house was ablaze with light. My automated timers had done their job with clinical precision, illuminating every hallway, every nook, and every staircase. But the brightness felt hollow, a thin, superficial glow that didn't reach the true corners of the rooms. It was a light that didn't provide warmth, only visibility for whatever might be watching. I stood in the entryway, my chest heaving, clutching my phone as if it were a holy talisman. The no-service icon mocked me, a gray void where my connection to the human world used to be. I was a prisoner in the very sanctuary I had built to protect me. I paced the living room, my eyes darting to the heavy blackout curtains I had installed to keep the night at bay. I checked the seams, making sure no sliver of the indigo night could peek through and offer a handhold for the dark. I was waiting. I didn't know for what, but the air in the room was becoming pressurized, heavy and thick with the weight of an impending strike. The silence was absolute, a heavy velvet cloak that smothered the sound of the refrigerator and the hum of the heater. It was the kind of silence that precedes a tectonic shift, the quiet before the earth opens up. Then, the phone rang. The sound was so sudden, so violently loud in the pressurized quiet of the house, that I nearly dropped the device. My hands were so numb I could barely feel the glass of the screen. I looked at the caller ID. It was her, my daughter. My heart leapt into my throat, a painful fluttering bird, as I swiped the screen to answer. "Baby? Baby, are you there? Tell me where you are." I screamed into the phone, my voice cracking with a desperation that bordered on madness. What came back was not the voice of the cheerful, bright 11-year-old I had hugged goodbye 3 days ago. It was a sound that sent a jolt of pure primordial terror through my soul, It was crying. But it wasn't just any crying. It was that restless, desperate, breathless sobbing I had heard 25 years ago in the narrow alley between the broken walls. It was the sound of a spirit being unraveled, a rhythmic, wheezing wail that didn't pause for air, as if the person crying had forgotten how to breathe and could only mourn. "Mom," she shrieked. The word was jagged, torn. Her voice was shaking so badly it was less like speech and more like a vibration of pure fear. "Mom, please. I'm scared. It's so dark. Where are you? Is your dad there? Look at me. Focus on my voice," I yelled, my eyes scanning the empty living room, as if I could see through the walls, through the miles, to wherever she was being held. "She's here, Mom. She's right outside the cabin window. I can see her wings, they look like dead skin," my daughter wailed. The sound of her panic was a physical weight, crushing the breath out of me, making my own throat feel constricted. "She says she knows you, Mom. She says she remembers the one that got away. She says she's coming to finish the collection. She says she needs the set to be complete." The blood in my veins turned to slush. In the background of the call, I heard it, the faint, rhythmic clicking of the layered, discordant giggle. It wasn't coming from my daughter's throat. It was the sound of multiple voices, some old, some young, all laughing in a terrible, out-of-sync unison that resonated through the speaker and into my very palm. "Listen to me," I shouted, trying to anchor her, to drag her back to reality with the sheer force of my will. "Hide. Under the bed, in the closet, anywhere with light. I'm coming for you. I'm in the car right now." I lied to her, because the truth was too much to bear. "Mom, she says she's already there," my daughter whispered, her voice suddenly dropping from a scream into a chilling, hollow tone that sounded hollow and empty. "She says the longest stretch, it doesn't end at the street, it ends in your bedroom." The line erupted into a deafening cacophony of static, a screeching metallic roar that sounded like bone being ground against bone in a mechanical press. Then, total, terrifying silence. I looked at the screen. The call had disconnected. The signal bars were gone again, replaced by that hollow, mocking no-service icon. I stood in the center of my brightly lit living room, and for the first time in my adult life, I realized that light is just a different kind of mask. It doesn't protect, it doesn't build walls. It just makes it easier for the predator to see the exact moment the prey realizes it's trapped. My fortress was a cage. Suddenly, a loud structural bang echoed through the house. It didn't come from the front door or the windows. It wasn't the sound of an intruder breaking in. It came from directly upstairs. It was a heavy, resonant sound, like something massive and solid had been dropped onto the floorboards of my master bedroom. The house seemed to groan under the weight of it, the joists creaking as if a great burden had been placed upon them. I went completely silent. My breathing stopped. My pulse was a dull, thudding roar in my ears. I stood at the foot of the stairs, my eyes fixed on the darkness at the top of the landing. The hallway light was on, but the darkness seemed to be leaking out from under my bedroom door, thick and oily. The silence that followed the bang was expectant. It was a silence that was listening to the rhythm of my terror, savoring the chemical scent of my adrenaline. I found myself moving toward the stairs. I didn't want to. Every logical, self-preserving instinct I possessed was screaming at me to run out the front door, to flee into the night, to scream for help until my lungs gave out. But the compulsion was back. That same morbid magnetic pull that had drawn me into the alleyway all those years ago. It was as if my feet were being moved by invisible wires, as if I were being reeled in. I climbed the stairs, each step a testament to my own undoing. The wood groaned under my weight, sounding like a chorus of small, dying voices. The hallway upstairs was dark. The timers hadn't reached this part of the circuit yet. Or perhaps the dark had simply extinguished them. I reached the door to my bedroom, my hand trembling as I reached for the cold brass knob. The metal felt unnaturally frigid, as if it were made of black ice. I pushed the door open. The room was bathed in the pale, artificial glow of the street lamp outside the window, the same sickly light that had illuminated my bad dream 25 years ago. My bed was neatly made, the pillows fluffed, a portrait of domestic order. The ceiling fan was spinning slowly, its motor emitting that familiar low groan that sounded like a dying animal, but the shadow on the wall was wrong. Against the far wall, opposite the window, a black shape was pressed like a stain. It wasn't the shadow of the dresser, the chair, or the bedpost. It was a long, narrow silhouette that defied the laws of optics, casting a shadow where there was no light to create one. It was hunched, its limbs elongated and spindly, its posture that of an insectile predator waiting for the exact moment of impact. I stood in the doorway, frozen, petrified. My heart was a frantic, dying drum. I watched, my eyes wide and stinging, as the shadow began to move. It didn't move across the wall like a normal reflection. It moved out from it. The two-dimensional darkness began to gain depth, pulling itself away from the wallpaper with a sound like wet silk being torn. From behind the edge of the wall where the shadow met the actual structure of the room, I saw them. Long, skinny fingers, pale, translucent, and so thin I could see the dark shapes of the bones beneath the skin. They were tipped with yellowed needle-like nails that looked like they had been carved from old teeth. They curled inward one by one, gripping the edge of the drywall with a strength that made the plaster crack and crumble into dust. I could hear it then. The wet, rhythmic licking of cracked lips. The sound of a gray, pointed tongue emerging and vanishing. And then, the giggle. It was the same layered, discordant sound. It was the voice of the girl who had cried in the alley, the voice of the mother who had told me it was a dream, and the voice of the collector who had waited 25 years for this singular moment of reunion. It was a sound that promised that the harvest was finally ready, that the soft ones had matured, and that the cycle was about to close. I told you, the voices whispered, the sound seemingly coming from the very walls, the floorboards, and the ceiling fan above me. The soft ones, the pure ones, they are always worth the wait. They hold the most memory. I realized then that my parents were right, in a cruel, cosmic way. It wasn't a dream, it was a debt. And as the skinny fingers tightened their grip, pulling the rest of the creature's hunched, winged form out of the dark, I knew that the longest stretch had never really ended. It had just been waiting for me to get home. I looked at the shadow one last time, my vision beginning to blur with the same dark, oily spots I had seen as a child. My daughter's voice echoed in my mind, a final, chilling revelation. Mom, she says she knows you. The tooth fairy had come home, and she wasn't leaving until the collection was finally complete.